Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar presentation, Novel AI, Diagnostics and Technology in Pulmonary Fibrosis by Colin Edwards. Colin is the Chief Scientific Officer and co-founder of patientMpower Limited, an Irish digital healthcare company specializing in monitoring lung and kidney health. He is responsible for development and implementation of the Clinical and Health Economics Evaluation Program for patientMpower in respiratory, interstitial lung disease, post-lung transplant, COVID-19, and renal conditions. Founded Merlin Consulting Limited in 2015 to advise creators of digital health products and develop robust assessments in the impact of new technologies on patient outcomes. Colin was previously General Manager, Head of Medical Affairs at the Ireland affiliate of Boehringer Ingelheim. He's a member of the Institute of Directors in Ireland. Thank you for joining us today, Colin.
Thank you, Sharon, and good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, and thank you for asking me to talk. So I'm going to talk about where novel AI approaches, artificial intelligence approaches, can be used in technology, applied to new ways of measuring health in pulmonary fibrosis, with a strong focus on patient-reported data and patient-reported symptoms contributing to management of pulmonary fibrosis and better understanding of pulmonary fibrosis. Next slide, please, Sharon. So these are my disclosures. I'm a founder of patientMpower.com, and I also, as Sharon mentioned, I've founded a digital health consulting company called Merlin Consulting. Next slide, please. So just to say a bit about where this has come from, I mean, with the development of electronic tools to record health and the development of mobile applications which allow people to input information, it has really sort of changed or opened up the possibility of how health and health research can be delivered. And it has been, like most things, fueled by technical or technology developments. And just to talk a bit about the overall mobile health or digital health market, this is pretty new area as it is for in other areas such as travel and finance, but this is a new and rapidly changing market. Before 2007, there wasn't any such thing as an app. And by 2017, which is, you know, when the last sort of big survey of how many apps or numbers of apps availability, there were something like 350,000 health or wellness apps coming from a huge number of health app publishers, but many apps had quite small numbers of users. Most apps had less than 5,000 downloads, and in general, most apps aren't used for a very long time. And by now, it's still estimated that there's roughly a similar number of health and wellness apps spread across all areas of health and wellness. Some of them are very, very good. Some of them are probably less good. And there's probably something like 55,000 health and wellness apps stored or available on the major health apps stores, or the major app stores such as Google Play Store and the Apple App Store. There's been a sort of, the pandemic has accelerated the development of interest in health apps and remote capture of information and remote feedback of data to their doctors. Next slide, please. And then there's been some research done surveying digital health companies, really trying to establish what they feel is the key areas of interest or the likely future areas of interest on business potential. And it might be surprising, but actually the largest sort of proportion but in terms of disease category, most companies feel that there's much great opportunities in mental health and cardiology, and there's actually quite a number now of health apps in mental health. metabolism and endocrinology, which is largely fueled really by diabetes. A lot of people with diabetes are accustomed to measuring their glucose levels very, very frequently, and this lends itself very well to sort of mobile health apps to capture that information. But this was a survey of about 300 companies, and only about 12% of those companies saw opportunities in respiratory medicine, which I thought was quite surprising, given that there are many respiratory conditions and it affects an awful lot of people worldwide. This is very recent data. I've got web links in the slides to where these come from, but all this information is publicly available. But you can see the use of mobile technology is now spread across a wide range of medical conditions. Next slide, please. And this, in the same survey, asking the same companies, looking at the key digital trends that are seen as of interest at the moment, artificial intelligence and digital therapeutics are very much top of the list. And I'll come back to that later in the talk, because with mobile health apps connected to devices, it opens up the possibility of generating a lot of data, which when it's linked up with other data may lead to much better understanding of diseases and their treatments. But you can see that telehealth and remote patient monitoring, which are kind of very related topics, are quite high up the list as well. So remote patient monitoring being where a patient with a condition is capturing data, and that data is available to their healthcare provider in real time to help in treatment decisions. And telehealth is related to that, where you might have a phone call or a video call with your healthcare provider, but linked to that, you're going to have data that's being reported by you on the remote patient monitoring system. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk quite a bit about home spirometry in this talk and where this fits in to this. So as you probably know, this is a forced expiratory technique, which is quite difficult to do, but it's becoming more and more, there's more and more research on home spirometry and where it's going to fit into future diagnosis, staging, and healthcare. Next slide, please. So this is, the picture now is, now technology has made it possible for people to do spirometry at home. That data can flow from the spirometer to their phone via an app, and from there to the internet cloud, and from there to their healthcare provider. Next slide, please. Home spirometry has been around for some time. I mean, at least since the start of this century. The earlier devices were quite clunky. They displayed the data on the device immediately after the person had done the expiratory maneuver. They didn't usually store data, and it's very dependent on patients actually writing down data and phoning or bringing that to the clinic when they next saw their healthcare provider. And in the early days, forced vital capacity was not available on a lot of home spirometers, which limited its usefulness in interstitial lung disease or idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, as that's the most important measure. But there are studies from 20 years ago on home spirometry. So it's been around for some time, and a lot of learning about its value and its accuracy over that time. More recently, of course, devices have got smaller. They've got very, very good battery life, and they capture and store data. So data doesn't have to be written down, and they have the capability also, of course, of transmitting that data for cloud storage, but also transmitting it to the healthcare provider. Next slide, please. So there's been a lot of publications really since about 2015 using home spirometry in different settings in either interstitial lung disease or idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. And this is quite an early study from Russell at the Brompton Hospital, which is a centre in London, looking at home spirometry, daily home spirometry in patients with IPF, followed for approximately a year. The graph on the left is trying to assess the correlation between home spirometry and readings and clinic readings, because there has always been a concern that maybe home spirometry would not be accurate enough over time. But in fact, it actually has acceptable levels of accuracy. There is a tendency for home spirometry readings to be a little bit lower than what the same person would measure if they were in the clinic. But in the clinic, of course, you're in a very, very controlled environment, and you have a respiratory physiologist behind you shouting, blow, 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 so that you're actually encouraging you to actually blow out a little bit harder. But nevertheless, the little diamonds are indicating, if they're between the two dashed lines on that graph on the left, that's indicating that the accuracy of the home spirometry is within acceptable limits of clinic spirometry. So it is now widely regarded as, particularly for following trends of spirometry readings over time, that home spirometry is now regarded as being of good enough accuracy to follow a person's progress as their condition develops. The graphs on the right show three different examples from three different people in this study where the spirometry data behaved in different ways. In the upper graph, the person is, their forced vital capacity is slowly declining over time. These graphs go out to about 400 days of follow-up, and there's nothing really dramatic happening in that person's condition. In the middle graph, graph B, unfortunately, this person's forced vital capacity declined very, very rapidly. You can see from the shape of the slope there of the curve. And in graph C, which is a different person, this person had a rapid decline in their forced vital capacity, and they had an exacerbation around about just before day 200. They then recovered some of their forced vital capacity from the bottom of that slope there, but they never actually got back to the level that they were at when they actually started measuring. So you can see different patterns in different people depending on how their condition is progressing. Next slide, please. So this is actually a study from Canada that was published a couple of years ago. This was looking at regular home spirometry, 3 readings a day for a period of 12 weeks. And in this study, the patients couldn't actually see their data. Their data was visible to their clinical care providers, but it wasn't visible to the patients in real time. And there was good adherence to measurements. Patients were measuring very, very frequently and also persistently through the 12-week period. And the table at the bottom shows that the top row there shows the clinic FVC, which was ranging from 2.77 to 2.7 over time. And the home FVC actually showed quite close agreement with that, but it did show perhaps some decline in the home FVC values over time, suggesting the importance of maintaining correct home spirometry technique over time, and the importance perhaps of revising or reissuing sort of training on how to do spirometry over time. Next study, please, or next slide, please. This was another group at roughly the same time developed. This is a group from the Netherlands at the Erasmus University. They developed an online home monitoring program with a small spirometer, just looking at data over 4 weeks, which was really trying to evaluate, would this be acceptable to patients, and also if there was good correlation between home and clinic spirometry. And I'll come back to this. This group has done quite a lot of work on this, and I'll come back to that later. But overall, readings were a little bit lower for the home values versus the in-clinic values, which other people have seen. And there was good adherence over 4 weeks, and it was highly acceptable to the patients in this study. Next slide, please. So one of the things that's very important, if regular collection of data is going to be useful, it's important that it's feasible for people to do, and that people are willing to do it and are able to do it. And with a group at London And other centres in the UK, we've just completed a study asking the question if daily home spirometry was feasible for patients. And this was a 3-month study where patients were asked to provide one spirometry measurement and one pulse oximetry measurement every day for a period of 3 months. And the short answer was that in this population, it was very acceptable to patients, and patients actually, on average, patients provided a reading on 83 days of the 91 days. The large number of patients, or a large proportion of patients, recording data more than 3 days a week and more than 70% of days. So we achieved a study endpoint, and it seems that at least in interstitial lung disease, and this was in a usual care setting, it wasn't a very complex trial, it's feasible for people to actually do spirometry every day for a period of 3 months. And many of these patients have actually continued to do spirometry even though they're not on study. Next slide, please. Looking at it in a more long-term way, asking the same question about feasibility of home spirometry. This is a study from Dr. Kerry Johansson. This was done at several sites across the US and I think in Canada as well. But this was asking the question, is adherence to home spirometry feasible over a longer period of 40 weeks? And in this study, patients were asked to do a weekly study. And this was published about 5 years ago, I think. So there was good adherence overall, but there was some tailing off of adherence to home spirometry in the longer follow-up period in this particular study. And the graph on the right is showing the variability for each line is a individual patient's data. There's quite a degree of variability in home spirometry readings over time, but overall the trend was quite flat. There wasn't any marked deteriorations in most patients. Next slide, please. Looking at the same question, and this is a completely different study. This was a pharma-sponsored drug trial where patients were randomized to nintedanib or placebo and then followed up for a period of about 52 weeks. And in this study, patients were asked to provide a reading once a week. And the weekly adherence over the whole year was actually very high, mean of 86% or median of 96%. But interestingly, although patients were only asked to provide one reading a week, on average, patients provided over 3 readings a week, suggesting that at least in clinical trials, it is feasible for people to actually provide readings more than once a week, which opens up the possibility of collecting a lot of information over time with an individual patient. So it's encouraging data. Next slide, please. This is quite a complex graph. This is from some of our own work, and this is looking at adherence in very, very long-term users of a remote monitoring system. These people were not actually in a clinical study, or they were not in a formal remote monitoring program. They were using the system purely as a health diary to record spirometry, which is FVC, which is in the top of the graph there, pulse oximetry, which is labeled O2, it's the second graph down, MMRC is breathlessness, which is the third graph down, and then the fourth graph is step count. And what green, as the colors go from blue to green, that's suggesting very, very frequent readings being recorded by people. And this is very, very long-term data ranging between 1,300 days and 1,900 days. So, from a period of about 4 years to about almost 6 years of, 5.5 years of data. So for some people, at least, find it very, very useful to regularly record that data. So blue on this chart means patients are reporting up to 10 times a week, whereas green means it's much more frequent than that. And it's clear in this very small sample, some people find it extremely useful to carry on recording data long term. Next slide, please. This is from the same group of people, and this is trying to graphically show how does the data within those people change over time. So in this chart, green means there's very, very little change over time, whereas blue, and particularly darker blue, means the patient's data are actually decreasing over time. And in this group of people, there hasn't been much change in their forced vital capacity or their their pulse oxygen saturation, but there have been some fairly marked changes in breathlessness score and marked changes in daily step count. So you can build a picture by combining this information of what's happening within a patient or within a group of patients. And I think what's noticeable from this small group is that sometimes changes in symptoms can happen without necessarily there being a change in the forced vital capacity. But again, it's sort of highlighting that some people at least do find it useful, because these people are not actually, as I mentioned, not in a formal study program or monitoring program. They're keeping this as a health diary themselves, and they agreed to share this data with us for this analysis. Next slide, please. So now, of course, I've been talking a lot about remote monitoring, which is where the person is at home, they're taking a measurement, but that measurement data is available in real time to their clinical caregiver. Next slide, please. So the group I mentioned before from the Netherlands, they actually also asked an interesting question: was, could participation in a home monitoring program have an impact on health-related quality of life for patients? And they did a very good study published just a year or two ago, where they compared patients with home monitoring and spirometry versus usual care. And the home spirometry data was available in real time to the clinical team. This study was conducted over 24 weeks and had quality of life was the key endpoint. Now, although there wasn't a statistically relevant increase in the quality of life score in the home monitoring group, there was a trend to improved psychological well-being as measured by that score. And there was also high patient satisfaction with good adherence to home spirometry and good correlation between the clinic and home spirometry. So there's a suggestion from this data that participation in a remote monitoring program might be of psychological benefit to people, although overall it didn't change their overall health-related quality of life. But I'm sure that work is continuing. Next slide, please. And this is in parallel with the development of the mobile technologies. There have been various groups developing ways in which patient-reported data can be held by the patient. And if the patient chooses to do that, they can share that with their healthcare provider or share it with research groups, to provide data that would help in the better understanding of the condition. Next slide, please. And this is a different group. This is a group called Patients Know Best. You may have heard of this. There's a very active group in the UK in particular, but this enables an individual to have a single place for all their health information, and they are the owner of that data. And they can add data themselves. They can choose who to share it with, whether it's a healthcare provider, whether it could be a family member who they might want to know that a family member is keeping an eye on them, or they could share with researchers. Next slide, please. I think this probably shows, next slide. This shows an example of screens of blood pressure data. So this is the patient view on the phones, but there's also a view for the clinical care provider. And if a patient, for example, moves house or moves to another part of the country, they can bring their data with them. So all of this is becoming possible because of technology developments. Next slide, please. So patientMpower ourselves, we've developed a platform where using devices, the person records data, they can see that data on their phone, it's captured by their phone, and it's immediately available to the clinical care provider. Next slide, please. And this approach addresses a couple of major issues in healthcare. I mean, one issue is it can release some hospital capacity for people who really need to be seen. If somebody has a chronic condition and they're relatively stable and the clinical care provider is confident that they're stable because they're seeing good data coming back from the patient, they could make a choice to not bring that patient in for an in-clinic visit, but maybe do a telephone call or video visit discussing the data with the patient rather than having the patient travel some distance to a center. Another issue this can help to prevent is to prevent emergency admissions, because there could be early signals of patient problems and they could be treated earlier rather than having the patient come in as an emergency because they've deteriorated very, very rapidly. And a third area is actually qualifying a patient for treatment. I mean, in some health jurisdictions, you cannot get access to certain treatments unless your forced vital capacity is meeting certain limits. So in a remote monitoring program, a patient could be monitored over time, and when they reach a threshold for initiating a new treatment, a decision can be taken then. And this usually means the patient would be identified earlier as qualifying for treatment. Next slide, please. This is an example screenshots of the other thing I should have said, of course, is that the remote monitoring data within a platform should also be able to feed into the electronic health record for that person at their healthcare center and become part of their electronic health record. These are some screenshots from a lung transplant monitoring program, which is run in our system at a center in the US. And so you can see here the clinician has quite a good overview of different health markers for this person. Next slide, please. I think it's another screenshot on the next slide. And this is from the same center and the same person. So there's screenshots here of the spirometry in that case, but putting all the data together, the clinician can build an overview picture of the patient's health. This center has been using the system in monitoring lung transplant patients after transplant since early 2018, and they have actually been able to reduce the in-clinic visits by about 2/3 over that time. Still do telehealth visits for the patients who they don't see, but it has been able to avoid or reduce travel by patients and in-clinic time. Next slide, please. So another area of interest is there's now a belief that change in patient recorded data might be better able to predict outcomes at an earlier stage. You may be familiar with the fact that in many clinical trials of new medicines or new treatments for IPF or ILD, patients have to be followed for up to 12 months. And change in FVC is seen as sort of the gold standard. Change in clinic FVC is seen as the gold standard for deciding if a treatment is useful or not. And this makes clinical trials very, very large and very, very long. There is a school of thought now being developed that change in forced vital capacity over 3 months may be able to predict response to treatments, or may be able to predict long-term outcomes in both placebo group or untreated patients, or also in patients who are treated with antifibrotic medicines. That depends on there being a very granular or very, very regular set of data over that 3 months, ideally daily data over 3 months. So you would have, something like 90 or 100 readings of data. There has been some early work done on analyzing some home spirometry data from currently run studies, which suggesting that 3-month change can predict some markers, perhaps breathlessness, perhaps quality of life. And when that is going to be linked with some long-term outcome studies, the picture will be clearer. But the data is hinting at the moment that 3-month change in home FVC might be a useful predictor of whether somebody may respond to a new treatment or where somebody may progress faster than somebody else. And this, if this hypothesis is correct, and it is being tested now, it will suggest that future clinical trials could be a little bit faster because promising treatments could be followed up and unpromising treatments, an earlier decision could be reached as to whether study design needs to be changed. Next slide, please. So this is being tested. One of the studies this will be tested in quite soon. There's a large study going on in the UK called Injustice, which is a long-term study, which is looking at outcomes over a long period of time in patients with different types of interstitial lung disease. And the study is to characterize biomarkers of progression. All patients in this study are now doing blinded home spirometry for the first 3 months. There's good adherence to that, as you would predict from the other studies, and there's good correlation of the home spirometry versus the clinical spirometry. So this study is still accumulating patients, but it will be completed in 2024, and that will go a long way towards answering this question as to whether 3-month data can predict longer term outcomes. Next slide, please. So bringing this all together, this is how future clinical trials could look, where the patient on a regular basis, and that's in the green bubbles on the left, is collecting a lot of data at home, physiological data like spirometry or blood pressure or pulse oximetry, data on symptoms, maybe data on the medicines they're taking, data on health-related quality of life or outcomes, patient-reported outcomes, and they're very straightforward things to measure like daily step count. And that could all feed into a data cloud, which is the little yellow bubble at the top. Patient has to give permission for all of these steps. That's the yes/no diamonds. The clinical team should be able to see all the patient data in real time so they can make a treatment decision about the patient. And also it should be theoretically possible for the data to also flow into the electronic medical record at the clinical site, so that all of the data flows very, very quickly, becomes part of the patient record. And other things that might be measured at clinic will also be feeding into that, like outcomes and other conditions that may be being measured. And the data also in real time could flow into the study database in blue, so that the study team would have real time insight of all of the data, including outcomes that are coming directly from the clinic, but also outcomes being reported by the patient. And this is going to be the model really for future and indeed current studies with much faster flow of data. And all of this is possible really because of development of really the capability of patients being able to capture data and that data being securely sent. But of course, it all has to be done with the permission, for privacy reasons, has to be done with the permission at every step. Next slide, please. So putting this all together, there's now many, many types of data being collected within interstitial lung disease and other conditions, of course. So you can have patient-reported data, data from high-resolution CT scans, which is and that kind of data lends itself very well to analysis. The clinical care centers would be collecting data on clinical outcomes or hospitalizations or worsening of condition. Genomic marker data is beginning to be better understood. And then lots of sort of objective data coming from the patient, such as spirometry, changes in weight, changes in exercise. So putting that all together, next slide, I think might be on the next slide, please. Oh yes, another question, of course, that's really key is, are people willing to share their data for research? And I think many people with chronic conditions are, generally speaking, willing to share their data, at least anonymized, for research purposes. We ran a remote monitoring program for COVID-19 at the start of the pandemic in about 3,000 patients, and we sampled 1,000 people to ask would they be willing to share their data for research, and about 90% of them said yes, that they would. And also, we recently sampled some of our long-term users, our data to ask if they would allow their data to be used for research, and 9 of them responded very quickly. The other 7 didn't respond because they probably weren't still using it frequently. And some people responded really quickly, one person responding almost straight away. Next slide, please. So coming back to that question of pulling all this data together, there are several research bodies set up now which are trying to find ways of pulling all of the data that's out there together to try and better understand how interstitial lung disease behaves, how it progresses, to see if we can uncover markers that could be used to develop new treatments. This is a group called OSIC ILD, and this is a collaboration between many different groups, between groups of who are providing CT scans, groups providing spirometry data, patients providing, or patient clinical care centers providing anonymized data on health outcomes in patients. The goal, this has been running for 5 years, and there was a lot of early work put into resolving the data, all the data privacy and protection concerns, but they have been resolved. And the goal in this year was to have 15,000 anonymized scans with accompanying clinical data for those patients. And it looks like that goal will be achieved because there's over 16,000 scans available now, and that data is being crunched at the moment. It takes quite a while to do this, but this now is beginning to pull in a lot of data and generating information on understanding why and how interstitial lung disease behaves, and why it and how it might behave differently in different people. Next slide, please. I think it's another OSIC slide. So it's beginning to pull together lots of different kinds of data. And this is going to be a very rich source of information in time, with some very sophisticated analysis of linkages between different biomarkers. And I think this will be very promising for uncovering potentially new treatments. Next slide, please. Interestingly, all of the tech giants are very interested in the digital health industry. There's some familiar names here, but there's also some unfamiliar names. The 2 at the bottom, I don't know where they're from or what they're interested in health, but this probably is going to be an issue where the data itself, with sophisticated analysis, will hopefully uncover better understanding of this condition and other medical conditions. Next slide, please, which may be my last slide, you'll be pleased to hear. So just to summarize, I think the literature so far suggests that some people are very willing to record data very regularly, and even for quite a long time, up to a year. And many people are willing to share pseudonymized or anonymized data for research. I think most people would say it's better to send data from their home rather than traveling to a clinic unless they really need to see the clinic. And the technology functions well now. Both the smartphones and the apps themselves are quite user-friendly. The devices function well. They're usually now quite small, and the batteries last quite well, and the devices themselves last quite well. The trends in home spirometry data over time can give a very good indication of respiratory health within an individual, and combined with other data can give a good understanding of how a condition behaves over time. And I believe that, you know, this will optimize the design of future studies. I think home spirometry will be part of future studies, and it may help to adapt the design of those studies so they run better and possibly become smaller and shorter. But better understanding of all of the data from all of the sources of data available is going to be very important in research. So I think that's my last slide. Next slide. So if you've any questions, or you want to get in touch with me later, or have any questions in case of something you don't think of, these are my contact details. They're on the slides. So I'll stop there and take any questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Colin. It's been very interesting, your presentation. We have some questions for you. First of all, many of our community wants to know, what about privacy issues? You know, when they're giving these data over the internet and being saved in the cloud, like what guarantees do they have that it's not going to go somewhere else by accident? You know, how's their name and other private information is encrypted so that it doesn't end up somewhere that it wasn't supposed to be?
Well, I guess nothing is 100% guaranteed in this world, as we know, but the cloud is now pretty secure. The information is encrypted when it leaves the phone and goes into the cloud. So even if it was actually intercepted while it was in transmission, it is encrypted, and it would be very difficult to establish where it came from or what the data was. And similarly, when it goes from the cloud to the healthcare provider, it's also encrypted all the way through that journey. The other side to it is that when in the remote monitoring program that we run, when a clinic wants to invite a patient to participate, the clinic sends an email to the patient, which has installation links in that, so that that patient's data is only linked to that clinic. There is a flip side to that, is that we've had the wish expressed by some of our patient users that they'd like their family members to be able to also see their data, because they may have a family member who lives some distance away, but it still wants to be involved in helping their family member. So we can, and we do, make it possible for people to have a family member have viewing access of data, but not data input, because that would change the data. But there are a lot of security processes around that transmission of data journey. We ourselves, it will be different for different companies or different providers. We ourselves host the data with Amazon, which is regarded as secure as it can be. But you're absolutely right, nothing is 100% secure. The patient is the only person who can see the patient can see all of their data, but it's really relying on technological safeguards. The other side of it is it's very, very clear, it needs to be made very, very clear to a patient user who's contemplating using a digital tool that their data is going to be transmitted somewhere, and where that is going to be. But in our case, it should only be the clinical center is inviting an individual to join that clinical center's remote monitoring platform. Then there are various safeguards, of course, in terms of who at that clinical center has view access to the data. So each person will have a unique ID and password. So one can always see which person has viewed that data, and that can be controlled. That needs to be controlled by the clinical care center, that type of access.
Well, thank you for that. The next question is, who actually owns this data?
That's different in different scenarios. So in a clinical monitoring scenario, if a particular hospital is treating a group of or reviewing a group of patients' data, the hospital is the data controller of the data that the hospital receives. So for example, if there's 10 patients and they're sending spirometry data and blood pressure data, the hospital becomes the data controller of the data reported by the patients. The provider of the service, which would be a company like us, we're a data processor. I'm thinking here in terms of sort of European descriptions of the law, but we're a processor of the data. So we're not the owner of the data, but we're processing the data on behalf of other people. But the patient is also the owner of their data. So in our own case, we keep all data for as long as a person is using it available in the cloud. until 7 years after they stop using it. So 7 years after the last time a person has used the data, we will pseudonymize that data, or anonymize that data, I should say. We'll put into a general pool, but it can't be linked back to a person.
Okay. We got another question for you. So if the hospital, let's say, or the clinical trial owns that data because I participated, how can I make sure that it's not utilized for profit? Because many of our community feels very strongly that if they participate in something and then it helps you to create something and you give it back to the community, like why should they have to pay for that? It should be given to them for free since they participated, and it should be given to all patients, right? So how can they make sure that if there is something to be profited from it, that the community gets to share in that profit, or that individual?
That's probably a question for other people, but one of the things that we've seen now, I've seen a lot in the studies we participated in, is that very question is asked now frequently as part of the informed consent processes. Do you consent for your data to be shared with other bodies or other, should I say, sort of other institutions or other potential, which could include companies outside of the setting of the clinical trial? And some people say no to that question, but it shouldn't prevent them, it shouldn't exclude them from participation in a study if they meet the criteria and they've consented to the other part of the study. But that is a broader societal question, which is completely understandable. But I do think, because we've asked people, do will you share, for example, I showed some data there on the long-term users, and we asked the people, can we share your data with, it was in that case, it was a university in London, to look at the patterns of recording of data and the patterns of what happened to the data, because we're trying to understand what happens over the long term. And people were very willing to do that. But I do take the point, it's completely understandable that if a for-profit institution is profiting from the data, what should be the arrangement, if any, for profit sharing? Would it be that something should go back to the patient community, a patient community body in general, for the betterment of the services that they can provide? That might be a route for that. But it's a broad question that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, because a couple of people have said in the questionnaire, they're saying, why would I participate in something to make pharma or whoever is trying to do something money, right? And whereas others said, what, I want to do something to make sure that I can help others who come before me, like after me, because the people who before me who did all these clinical trials, I'm benefiting from that. So there's two sort of distinct streams.
There is, I've worked in clinical trials for a long time. My gut feeling is most people want to give their data for research, even if it's pseudonymized and they know it's not going to help them. I think there's a genuine altruism in people who have chronic conditions, irrespective of what it is. But also, I think some people are somewhat annoyed that maybe institutions are profiting from their data as well, and what that balance is and how to get that right, I don't know. We could have a whole webinar on that, which would be quite an interesting discussion. But we'd want to hear from, you'd want to get a lot of voices in that. It could be a very interesting discussion, I think.
Right, because someone said there's a distinction between sharing your data, allowing the person who's collecting the data for the clinical trial, sharing it with other researchers, versus selling them the data.
Yeah.
So it's a very hard sort of line to walk. Like, you want to help, but then you're also thinking, are they selling my data, or are they really actually sharing my data?
Yep.
Right. Okay. I was just going to say that, you have this spirometry and everything. It seems to be very accurate. Would you say that for some patients who are very concerned, like, how do I know I'm doing this right? Like, even though you've demonstrated and everything, how do I know that I've done it right?
I think that's a really important question, because the value of the whole process depends on people being able to do it right and being confident that they're doing it right, and also that if one sees changes in one values in one's spirometry values, that you understand what they mean. It's day to day there will be variations in what somebody blows. I can guarantee if I was doing spirometry every day, I would see dots around an imaginary straight line, but there would be variation in that. So I think there needs to be a lot of thought put into the flow of information. I mean, if I'm a clinical center and I have some patients and I want to invite them into the self-monitoring program, whether it's for healthcare delivery or whether for a study, that I really need to understand, for example, I need to say, okay, I'd like you to maybe do this twice a week, maybe on Mondays and Fridays, and also give very, very good instruction on how to work with the particular home spirometry, because it's a different machine from what somebody might be used to in the clinic. Number one thing, it's going to be much, much smaller, irrespective of which device it is. It's going to be a lot smaller and probably a lot simpler. And I may not have things like nose clips and other things like that. So you need very good instructions. Also, I think it needs to be, one thing we have in our remote monitoring is that when a clinician is looking at the data from a spirometry blow, they can actually see the shape of the flow volume curve and the volume time curve, which is what they would see in the clinic as well. And they can make an assessment as to whether that patient's blow on that day was a good quality blow. We can also, and other people can also, introduce some degree of automation to that process as well, so there's not a subjective judgment. There are now software which can analyze the data in a very, very granular way and decide, does it meet the recognized criteria for spirometry quality? So, and if it happens that a patient's quality of blow is changing or deteriorating, the clinic should intervene, and the intervention could be as simple as a phone call. Is everything okay? Are you sure you understand the process? Do you want to set up another call where we go through that again? We ourselves have a little YouTube channel with some YouTube video clips showing people how to do it in case they forget. I mean, the same could be true if you were trying to get someone to do an exercise, a physiotherapy exercise every day. You can forget how to do the exercise if it's a while since you saw your physio. So I think it's very important to work out the flow of information processes and have that discussion with the patient, not just at the beginning of the program, but at different intervals during time. So typically we would encourage, follow up in the first week, just everything okay? Do you understand everything? And, also looking at the data to see what is the data saying. If the data is all over the place, it's suggesting some misunderstanding of technique, but that can usually be fixed. There is another phenomenon with home spirometry that a lot of people have seen, is that in the first week, things are quite variable. And in the second week, they're a bit less variable in readings. And usually the readings in the second week are a little bit higher. And you'll find, so it's being able to explain that to someone, look, it's going to take a while before you get into the routine. And the other pattern of behavior is some people like to do this kind of stuff in the morning when they're getting up. It's part of their breakfast routine or their shaving routine or whatever. And some people actually they do it in the evening at the end of the day when they're sort of settling down to maybe watch TV or whatever they do in the evening. And we see a pattern that different people tend to have. They're either morning people or midday people or evening people. So it's a lot of thought should be put into just explaining it's going to change a little bit every day, number one. Learn your technique, get it into a habit. It's like any other habit, once you get into the habit, it becomes second nature. And also important to tell people what to do if they do see values changing, and what to do if they do feel worse. I mean, that's part of normal healthcare anyway.
Our final question, someone wanted to know if they were interested in doing a home spirometry on their own, just because they want to know how they are
Yeah,
every day.
yeah.
How do they, judge which one they should purchase? Because there's so many of them, right? How
There
do
are
they know if they got a
so
good
many.
one, that's that it's going to be reliable, so that if they felt that there was a pattern changing,
Yeah.
they could call the respirologist and say, look, I've been doing this at home for the last 3 months, and I notice a downward trend, or whatever their concern is.
First thing is, I would say most spirometry really should be prescribed. People shouldn't go out and just buy a spirometer, which you can do. I think you can buy them. So it should be done as part of a discussion with your healthcare provider. That's the first thing. The second thing is there aren't too many. There are some spirometry devices which are easier to get because they might just measure peak flow. The important thing is to make sure you're getting the right one, that if you have a condition where you have to measure forced vital capacity in particular, the spirometer needs to be able to measure forced vital capacity. And so that's part of the discussion with the healthcare provider as well, of course. And the other mark is the spirometer should be appropriately quality marked as being certified to meet regulatory standards, which could be Canadian standards, FDA standards, or in Europe would be something called a CE mark, which means it meets European standards. So, any good spirometer will have those, and it will be in the product literature with it. There are a range of devices out there. There are probably best to have one that actually captures the data via Bluetooth and sends it into your phone so that you're not having to record anything. But to be honest, I think these days that would be most spirometers anyway. There are a range one could recommend. There are different schools of thought about some spirometers work by a little propeller turning round, and some spirometers work by pressure changes. There's different schools of thought about which are better. It depends on which manufacturer you talk to, but they're all quite good. But I think the key would be make it part of the discussion with the healthcare provider, number one, and do it on their recommendation rather than doing it independently. And also check that it has the appropriate regulatory labeling and regulatory marks in the product literature. Any decent spirometry will, anything that doesn't have those isn't going to actually, frankly, be you can't guarantee that it's going to be accurate enough.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your presentation today, Colin. I know that our audience have learned a lot, along with myself, and you certainly brought up some really good points that are going to make us think about the privacy issue, and that it should be prescribed rather than going out and buying it ourselves. Because a lot of our patients are, very keeners, and they would like to go out and do these things just to see how they're doing.
Yeah.
And we appreciate that advice.
Okay. Well, thank you for asking me to talk, and I hope everything goes well for you and all the other folk out there.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Okay.